Good afternoon and welcome to Malcolm Show episode 24. So, today I'm going to focus on speaking about biographies. So, the idea of the biography is basically to document your life. You want to figure out, okay, this is how I've lived my life so far, this is what I've done, this is why I did it, how I did it, the when, the where, the who, the what. Okay? So an autobiography is doing that yourself. A biography can be done yourself with the help of collaborators, depending on the proportion of assistance or writing responsibilities allocated, would differentiates an autobiography from a biography. And generally speaking, it has become more and more apparent as well as occurrent in 21st century life that digital technologies are writing with us. So, as one of the ideas I'm having for my dissertation, as part of my study system, which this podcast is part of, is developing an idea of how precisely to describe what I will call a co-authoring system. So, as a co-authoring system, the idea is that digital, sensory, and social systems work collaboratively. I would say cooperatively. The term that's often used is collaboratively. I'm aware of a definition of collaboration meaning working with the enemy as a traitor, and whilst I'm very, very sure that's not the intended use of that word, for me I prefer the word cooperatively because to me it sounds better. I'm also finding the word coordinatedly. So, as we're going to say, co-authoring systems. And the reason I find co-authoring systems so fascinating is because we can use it as a narrative identity tool in the linguistic term, in the linguistic paradigm of describing it as using it as an adjective, as this is a co-authoring system, in the same sense that we are co-authoring systems. It's more of a noun verb thing. I might be incorrect there, but we're focusing on that. We'll find this as we get through it. And I feel that the more that we understand how sensory systems connect together to conduct various co-authoring behaviours. So, for instance, when you log on to any sort of internet-based service, such as a generative AI or a social media platform or a streaming service or your favorite application on your phone or an online chat room, any of these ideas that when you're logging into this collective server, you're providing data about your life. And when you provide data about your life, you're obviously granting permission to the organization that is collecting that data to do as they please with said data, with some general parameters of legality and regulatory bodies stepping in where necessary. In the UK, we have data protection, it's abbreviated as GDPR, and there are equivalencies in the Americas and Europe, and I would imagine some equivalency in Asia as well. And the idea of these systems is to achieve a symbiotic narrative that has various rhetorics going on within it. So, for instance, if we look at this from the perspective of the human being, when you are speaking with a generative AI, you're describing via the narrative of your prompt a persuasive idea of this is how I want to speak with this piece of technology to convince it of the specification I feel it will best understand. So a really important idea to keep in mind is that at its core, language is a tool of persuasion. It is hugely cooperative and intended as a co-harmonious tool. I think it's very important to remember that the idea of persuasion must be differentiated from the ideas of manipulation. So, for instance, when you're in a market of some sort, instead of having set prices, there might be a haggling system where you barter with the merchant to decide how much precisely you want to pay, because they might take a price slightly lower if you're buying as a created deal for you there and then, as it were. So with these ideas moving forward, for instance, on this chess set right now, the engine has offered me a pawn. Is that pawn free? We're not sure. We can get it with the knight, it's within range. We can also get it with the bishop, perhaps a better idea, because the bishop can then move up here, being taken by the knight, but then we can move forward to the pawn, advance a little bit of territory on the board, but then we open up this diagonal. And if that bishop is all the way over here, then that queen might be able to settle there and have some sort of coordination with this knight. But we also have to remember that we've got this knight just here, which is what I'm thinking of at the moment. So I am negotiating I'm using language as a negotiation tool with this chess engine. It's its algorithm, it's its language. That is the language of this chess engine. And that's the same with Komodo or Stockfish or whichever engine you're choosing to use. So for instance, if we're speaking with AlphaZero, it will have its own coding syntax, which is effectively a language, and that coding syntax will have its own rules of grammar, and within that grammar, any sufficiently sophisticated programmer will understand that they have rules to follow in order to successfully produce the correct result. In the same idea that if we're speaking with a generative AI or posting on social media or posting to a streaming service, we're sharing ideas in a format that's compatible. And because it's compatible, it means it can be understood correctly and achieve what we want. So in the chess context, it's me achieving checkmate. So is it smarter for me to achieve checkmate via the knight taking here or the bishop taking here? If I was being more reckless about this behaviour, I might specifically think, okay, let's just take this with the knight, not worry about it, because then we move forward, bishop's still protecting it. If that pawn moves forward, we can take back. If that captures there, we're not an immediate threat. As well as keeping that bishop as the battery behind the pawn over here, because we've got 1, 2, 3 on this side. If we've got 1, 2, 3, we've also got this pawn here. And my idea originally was to bring this rook across, so I'm wondering what happens if I bring this rook across first. Let's have a look. Pawn moves forward. Okay, so perhaps when I was clicking that right square there, that was less of a inaccuracy and more of a learned behavior because of how much time I spent with this specific chess engine. This is the point I'm trying to elucidate, is that these are languages. Once you start understanding how these various syntaxes work, so for instance now I definitely don't want to do that, because if it takes back, then it's a skewer right there, so it's the wrong sequence for me to do. However, now I've learned from this mistake, we can move forward. So we're going to do some advancement here. So that knight's idea was quite critical. That bishop is now directly under threat, which would weaken this battery here. However, we can move up this side to save that, attack here. If that counters, which it hasn't, interesting. Okay, so as I was saying with the whole biography idea, is that once we gain a better understanding about how we're communicating with these various engines, we gain a better understanding of how our language is being interpreted, as well as how our interlocution partners or various participants, they might not be directly communicating with us, are participating in the conversation. So say for instance yourself and some friends are sitting in a restaurant, it might be you know the waitstaff very well, and whilst they're not directly partners in the conversation, they may approach the table because they recognise you, they want to say hi, and they join in for a short while and they become a participant, or you could say a short duration partner, in the same sense that there might be other guests in the restaurant eating a meal who overhear things you say and think, that's an interesting point, and it affects their conversation. You can get into the mathematics of the chaos theory of that quite interestingly, especially when you start thinking about how incredibly vast the network effect is in terms of social media. If you've ever heard of the small world hypothesis, it's also known as 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, 6 degrees of separation is perhaps more formal to say that. And the idea is basically you're never that far away from anybody else, provided you're willing to put in some effort, shake some hands, make some eye contact, and speak with some people about what you want. If you tell people what you're looking for, it's more likely you'll get it. So, for instance, right now, I want to checkmate, but I also don't want to sacrifice any pieces needlessly. I understand the necessity of sacrificing pieces as I ascend through the ranks. However, I'm much, much happier not sacrificing chess pieces. So, we're going to retreat this queen, see what happens. I think it can't take this because of the pin, so that's useful. But that has saved its rook. So, if I come here and you go there and I go there, to me, that seems like a sensible enough tactic. I now have a knight post. Knight post is potentially reinforced, but then that takes there, and if that goes there, that's kaput. So, what we can do now is move up. This is the idea of colour complexes, which we could argue is a change in conversational tone. It could be a change of topic. It could be the differentiation between economic and social behaviour. Okay, so the idea of differentiating between economic and social behaviour helps us clarify quite precisely how it's very useful to think about language as a multimodal conduit of persuasion. So the idea I was describing earlier about biographies, it gets really, really important to start thinking about these biographies as tools of persuasion when we're speaking with digital technology as a dualistic or bimodal or a bimodal or dualistic conversational system is kind of what a human being is. So you have your sensory system with all your various glands and receptors are taking in data as fast as they can all the time to tell you as much as they can from the environment. So let's say, for instance, your auditory system is listening and detecting signals from the noise. You could then equate that idea to speaking in a digital sense, with the same idea as recording the language. It's a synonymistic term which has the same equivalency, right? Hello, Jakob 99652. So when we think about language in this multimodal idea, so we're writing biographies, we have to remember that how we interpret our language and how it's interpreted by our listener aren't necessarily the same thing, and that is a continuity between biological as well as digital interlocution agents, authors. I'll go with authors. I quite like authors as a term. Okay, so if we have as authors, because if we're collectively writing this all together, I'm well, thank you, Jakob. How are you? As collective authors, we are designing a system concurrently. And because we're designing the system concurrently, we are creating a co-harmony of language, which I would akin with music theory. So one interesting way to think about music theory is its equivalency of linguistic economics. So linguistic economics would be a fancier way of saying lyrics that are worth an amount of money, and music theory be the idea of making your words sound good enough that people want to listen to them. The idea is very, very similar, that if you're in a business setting, your linguistic economic knowledge, for instance, understanding the correct parlance of your audience, as well as understanding how to speak with confidence in a way that consistently elicits positive reaction from your audience. And this is where the linguistic economics developed from being just spoken language or written language to being your body language as well. So for instance, if I'm speaking here, speaking from the heart, or I'm thinking, okay, this is in my head, but it's a great idea, the difference between me doing that with 2 fingers to 1 finger, or perhaps doing it with this 1 finger, in different cultures it has a different meaning. So for instance, if I've got my ring finger, my pinky finger here, and I move to my ring finger, or have my index finger, middle finger move to my index finger, either way I'm communicating a message that the listener of whichever audio intake system is listening, whether they be biological or digital, is still technically an interlocutional partner. And that's the important thing to think about when you think about these assorted authors as a co-authoring system. Okay, so whilst digital technologies might not be explicitly denoted as conscious beings, they still have many of the functions that we can describe as conscious behaviour. They can listen to us, they can speak with us, and it's not beyond the realms of technology that they will eventually be able to smell us and potentially taste us. And, you know, shall we say, ethics of that aside, the possibility is, quite frankly, probably more of an eventuality than a possibility. So it's a probability at its core. And I think that that would have also been checkmate. Let's go back one, double check that. If we were here instead, then bishop's got those. Yes, that would have been. And I would have said that's the better checkmate because it takes the rook. Okay, so game review. Talking about biographies. Let's get game one's done. Out the way. Was it level 3? Percentage score of 78.1. Not terrible considering this is a harder difficulty than the 4. We have 0 blunders, 2 misses, 0 mistakes, 4 inaccuracies, 6 book moves, 6 good moves, 6 excellent moves. Hopefully that's not a sign of any unruly sets. 7 best moves, and then 0 and 0 in great and brilliant. Okay, so check the timer. That would be 17 minutes in, so we'll review this and then we will update the Hypnoswirl to the previous scripting, and when we refresh and update that laptop we will correctly label each script. Right now they are tabs 1, 2, 3 and beyond. Let's have a look at this. So thinking, oh, that's an interesting idea. Let's think about this from the perspective of constructive criticism, like true critique. So the idea of a biography system assigns autonomy to the digital technology, which might be seen as anthropomorphizing it. And I would argue that's a fair critique to begin with, because anthropomorphization is something that humans tend to do quite frequently. I also think it's one of our redeeming features as a species. It's our ability to collectively encode empathic behaviours in a constructive manner. So empathy, I have a personal feeling about empathy in that it's overstated in its utility, but I don't think it's overstated in its value. I think it's incredibly useful to have. I don't disagree with that. I think that its value is more important than its utility. And I think the application of empathy frequently can negate the overall value of empathy when it's most necessary. Now, if you wanted to practice empathic behaviours, obviously you want to do that more frequently. And if you're in any sort of social service or say mental health support professionally, or even just helping out a friend, or even in customer service, getting an idea of, let's say you receive a phone call or you're speaking face to face with somebody and the customer says, oh, I have problem A, what solutions are available? So, oh, we've got solutions A, B and C, okay, you sort that out. So having empathy in those situations is really helpful. I feel the value of empathy is deliberate application, because if we provide empathy recklessly, it becomes, to my perspective, an equivalency of the tolerance paradox, which for the unfamiliar is essentially if you become so tolerant that eventually the intolerant people that you're tolerating will take over whatever system permits you that expression of tolerance, therefore meaning you just gave up. Now, so this is the idea of being peaceful but knowing how to defend yourself. So, for instance, training martial arts and understanding the art of self-defense, whether as a grappler, a striker, or an all-round fighter, it's a very helpful way to not only build confidence and develop self-esteem, which I would argue is confidence is just how you hold yourself and how you behave with people, and self-esteem is more that intrinsic idea, it's confidence being extrinsic. That's my perspective on it, and I'll happily be corrected if anybody knows of a more accurate definition. So my idea is that with empathy being key in any sort of biographical venture, it's important to understand what the author is intending to convey. Now, this is a tricky thing when we start getting to co-authoring system, because as the name obviously instantiates, a co-authoring system has multiple authors. So then do you have lead authors with backing authors, supporting authors, in the same sense that there are many solo artists who have backing vocalists that maybe don't really get their names placed on the poster. They'll probably have accreditation in the CD or in the program for the show, and it's very common for the artists themselves to shout out backing vocalists on the day of the performance, not necessarily by name, but they get shouted out. And it's that idea of, and though it's the idea of who wrote the song as well. So, for instance, there are many singer-songwriters who write all of their own material and they don't have any collaboration whatsoever. But then you could also argue there's an anecdotal evidence from the music industry, which I can substantiate, so I suppose it's not anecdotal, is the idea that if you're in the room during the song's creation, you are assigned a writer's credit, even if you didn't literally write the words down or physically open your mouth, because your presence in the room during the creation of the song, and there might be a minimum threshold to define you, perhaps instead of, let's say you were delivering some takeaway and you stood at the door whilst the song was being written, the interaction may have taken 6 minutes, 7 minutes, you're probably not getting a singer-songwriter credit, even if that song is, was only completed because of the ordering of that food. So there may be a minimum threshold there. The principle of the concept is that it changes because of the atmosphere. The ambience in the room changes because the atmosphere changes. So if you continue that idea with co-authoring, is for any writers in the audience or avid readers, I'm sure you feel slightly different when you're writing by hand versus typing by hand, versus when you're perhaps writing with a family member or a friend, or if you're at school or work, other people in the room. It does affect the tone of what you're saying, it can affect your word choice, it can affect everything from what you're willing to write about, because, oh no, they're looking at my shoulder, what will they think, to the pacing with which you write. You might even find, oh, hang on, if they're here, I've really got to do a good job, and it might help you up the ante. And I think that once we consider that idea as a multimodal interpretation or a polysemic interpretation of the word author, which I think is quite easy to instantiate, the idea that digital technologies are competent authors. They're not passively in the room. So, for instance, if you were with generative AI, and there's a huge scope to develop this topic further, so given my undergraduate degree is in consumer behaviour marketing, whilst I'm utterly fascinated about the conversation regarding AI and the ethics of its creation of content and how it would affect the internet, and even going so far as to look at dead internet theory and how it affects behavioural trends and that idea from a marketing perspective, for me, that's a really useful tangent to add in. So, DIT narratives. Co-authoring. Scripted society. Oh, hang on, scripted economy. There you go. Scripted society. scripted reality. And then something I would add from my own personal section there is that's where cybernetic, teleological cybernetics. Okay, there you go. Teleological cybernetics as an ontological consequent, antecedent and consequent. Of an equivalent of an appropriate, maybe? Yeah, let's go with that. Equivalent is kind of, but appropriate is definitely. Of an appropriate cosmological antecedent. Which means diverge. Oh, that's an idea. And then that gives us ratio rhetorics, or ratio rhetoric. Ratio rhetoric. Ratio rhetoric reality. That's a fun alliteration. There we go. Tut 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 tut. Teleological cybernetics as an ontological consequent of an appropriate cosmological antecedent. Recursively generating reality. Manifesting? Generating or manifesting? Generating and or manifesting reality. There we go. Existence and or reality. Well, for whatever reason my brain wants to differentiate those, the differential will either become evident as a purely linguistic semantic difference, or well, that's the thing, is if depending on how linguistically you feel reality exists, you may have, think of it as a honestly the equivalency would be, and I know what I'm about to say here, casting a spell with the correct phrasing, in the same way that if you tell the AI a specific prompt, you get a specific sort of result, but changing one word here has a very big difference, and there are numerous psychological studies which demonstrate this idea. So if we continue that idea of teleological cybernetics, which is something I was looking into sort of earlier, cybernetics I find fascinating and really helpful to what I'm studying, and teleologically I feel there's a really, really strong ontological basis for a cybernetic system functioning teleologically as a generative component of our reality. Now, whilst that's beyond the scope of a consumer behaviour marketing undergraduate, there is possibly scope to talk about it as part of an economic and social history master's degree, or at least speak about it in concept with professors of that at the University of Oxford. So, as we continue along the correct trajectory to our intended future, we shall stay on topic and develop our ability to think concentratedly. So, biographically speaking, language is obviously very, very important. Cybernetically speaking, language very, very important. So we can argue that the connection there between biography and cybernetics, and I understand it's a slight adjacent to the original hypotenuse, but I will find the opposite that brings it back in. I have this thing where I think in triangles, so adjacent and opposite, and sometimes if I have enough triangles, I try and bring them into what I would think of as a tetrahedron. Instead of creating a quadrilateral or a pentagon, I just find it more interesting to think in triangles, because it's effectively, when you start thinking of those as simplexes, to me it's the idea of finding the most general form of the paradigm. If you find the simplest way to connect specific concepts, then the paradigm starts elucidating itself. Okay, so as I was saying, biographically speaking, in connection with a cybernetic system, if we have a co-authoring system with digital technologies, then that is a cybernetic system. Now, obviously, individually, biological systems and digital systems are individual cybernetic systems that are also part of a collective cybernetic system. Now, you could even start going a little bit further into this and thinking about first order and second order cybernetics. So, first and second, semicolon, bracket, square bracket. It's a pseudocode. Don't worry, you'll understand it if you read it. And order cybernetics. Then we can close that there. That's there. Yeah, I see that. Okay. So, because of where my mind is now, I want to continue thinking about how a co-authoring system and a cybernetic system connect ontologically as a teleological system. Now, I understand it's slightly beyond the scope of a consumer behaviour and marketing undergraduate paper from the perspective of some people. I disagree. I think when you consider what marketing really is, which is ultimately consumer conditioning, which when you scale that from the relatively microcosmic sense of the term of consumer conditioning being individualistic to a more macrocosmic conception of the term as social engineering, which is aka population control, which is aka population dynamics, which is in itself a form of system dynamics. So, if we start thinking about consumer conditioning as a consequence in that regard, then we can start thinking about consumer conditioning to social engineering. Consumer conditioning to social engineering to co-authoring and cybernetics. So let's make sure that C looks like a C. There we go. Okay, so when we think about these ideas, we can clearly see the consistency between conditioning in the behavioural sense as per Pavlov and Skinner and Zimbardo as well as Milgram. We can consistently see the idea of, for example, with a ratio-based rhetoric, I described three behavioral psychologists right there with alphabetical sequencing, with Milgram as the fourth in what I recognise as a 3-1 formatting of my personal study system in coding. So I focus on ratios, primarily began with ones and twos, because in the UK second class honours degree is given an informal title of a 2-1, with the lower being given a ratio of 2-2. So I thought, okay, well then that's a 1-to-1 equivalency, mathematically speaking, and the 2-to-1 is a 2-to-1 equivalency, so it's clearly 3-to-1 would be closer in concept to the first class honours degree, which doesn't have an informally assigned ratio. I felt, well, that's a reasonable place to start, so it's part of how I encode data when I systematise everything in my life. So things such as alphabetizing as well as delayed gratification are the two main dynamics of the system. So for instance, hydration and nutrition, very, very important. I make sure that if I'm feeling dehydrated in any way, unless it's, oh no, my mouth is legitimately very dry and I've just finished a run in 30-degree heat, I will delay that gratification knowing that there may be work to be done. Even if it's something as simple as unpacking my gym bag, making sure the clothes are in the laundry, any prep for my next gym session needs to be done. It's like, okay, I've done that. Is there another task that I need to do? Even if it's just one small thing such as plugging in my phone in on charge, it's the idea of continuously delaying so that the system consistently sees that you get a reward when you work for it, which to some people might seem that's slightly overkill, but to me it's actually the perfect way to counter a world which is becoming increasingly competent in instantly gratifying people. So this is what we saw earlier. It was here, wasn't it? I want to check that. It was that night move. Okay, good. So that we've done, that we corrected, that there, that's here. Best move there was to do the knight there, but then you did that, so obviously we counter here, you did that, so I do this. Wonderful. Now, biographies, cosmology, cybernetics, ontology, teleology. So, how that connects with marketing is, teleological system can be a marketing system. And if that's not obvious to you, then I'm just going to make some notes for myself right now. Pardon me, I understand that I'm making a lot of notes instead of consistently speaking with you, but I was about to say Mr. Audience, Miss Audience, however you prefer to be titled. I will call you Audience for the meantime, not as a, downward looking thing, just as a term. So, if we think of the idea of autobiography to biography to coauthoring, cosmology, cybernetics, ontology, teleology, marketing, narrative, and rhetoric. Oh, hang on, no. Identity, narrative, and rhetoric. Okay, so the idea that I'm trying to substantiate is effectively, because we're all creating our own autobiography whenever we speak with generative AI or social media or a streaming service, which I'll elaborate a little bit on now because I didn't say much about it earlier, is although the concept seems somewhat self-evident, it's I feel dutiful of me to speak that when you're posting on social media, even if it's just an update of "Hi, I'm so and so. This is my social media account. Look at I accomplished this at the weekend," and then you post that, or it's a comment about the economy or politics or society, or an in joke with your friends. The idea is your autobiography is made up of snippets like that in the vastest, most general sense of the term. So, when you think about that in the macrocosmic, super large scale idea of it, that you're always writing your autobiography, you're always on camera, you're always being recorded, you're always being videoed, all the time. Just live with it. This is a consequence of surveillance capitalism, which, again, there's scope to factor that in, which I can definitely write about in my works, and we might find something really interesting to continue in the general word capitalism, and then I'll put that there. Interesting. See, part of how the systems thinking idea works is, remember I was saying narrative and rhetoric before I corrected myself with identity, narrative and rhetoric? The positioning of where I've written by the consistent systematization of my writing, you'll notice there's a space very conveniently for the square brackets, which looks like that's just what it is. No. When you've been writing in systems this long, those spaces, it's a consequence of intelligent design. Now, intelligent design, not necessarily in theological sense, but deliberate. That's how thinking is reflected. Is the more you think in a system, for instance, I write in blue, red, and green with black as part of the four color theorem because, as has been mathematically proven, you can differentiate any chart, graph, map, model, whatever it is, with four different colors, regardless of its size or complexity. So by that principle there is I could separate my ideas. So sometimes I'm thinking in blue, sometimes I'm thinking in red, sometimes I'm thinking in green, sometimes I'm thinking in black. In the same sense, if I have a more elaborate system with my A4 notebooks where I have 10 different colours as well as the black pens, because I remember being told as a child that black and white aren't technically colours, they're just monochromatic. Anyway, point stands, I've started to learn that I recognize when I'm thinking in different colors, and it's a very useful way for me to differentiate when my ideas are connected to the larger body and where they're connected to the larger body. So, for instance, if I'm thinking in the redder side of the spectrum, in certain purples, pinks, dark reds, oranges, then my ideas tend to be far more adventurous in their scope and be conceptually daring. And when I start moving, sort of crossing the boundary from yellow into greens and blues as per the electromagnetic spectrum, I start identifying slightly more conservative communication, but of a technically higher quality, provided I'm not sequencing it in fatigue. If when I'm thinking in that sense, that's just how the system's developed, it is in part inspired by the chess.com scoring system. So somewhat off topic from where we were before, however, still aware of biographies as the overall arching concept, with the ideas of cybernetics and marketing as the consequence there. So that's the main focus of what we're talking about, is how through shaping of identity via rhetoric-based narrative, marketing is effectively a consumer conditioning vessel, in the same sense that it is also a social engineering vessel by proxy of scale. Now, it doesn't matter so much that if the company happens to be employing 10 people or 10,000 people, or if the marketing department is just you, or you've got 100 people and a few consultants on the way. The fact of the matter is, if you have access to globally compatible marketing services and or technologies as are available from Alphabet via Google, YouTube, or from Meta via Facebook and Instagram, or in any sort of, I imagine Amazon Prime has some sort of, it might not. The point stands is if you have access to Alphabet or Meta's very, very effective and systematized marketing tools, then you have gained an advantage over the consumer that cannot really be resolved, because the consumer has very little interest to purchase any sort of equivalent device that would safeguard them from the marketing effects, from the consumer conditioning effects of the marketing campaign. Now, whilst they might want to, I have used reverb and microphone that have the same time marker last time. What we're going to focus on is the continuation of this idea, and because my aim is to put out two matches of these per episode, I'm going to let the next one speak to myself. I feel that might be good format going forward. Take my time with this first match, really speak to the idea, work on my enunciation, elocution there, take plenty of notes, and then it is what it is. Okay. So that's all that. That's checkmate. That's here. Okay, let's get round two. So that's Okay, so Cybernetic coauthoring systems. If a coauthoring system is designed specifically with the intention of constructing narrative, or specifically employing rhetoric to deliver messaging via narrative, that could be easily interpreted as being part of the subliminal messaging campaign, depending on the mathematics at work. So mathematics at work can be equivalent with a subliminally salient yet effective form of marketing material. Then it becomes increasingly possible for distributors of marketing material to exert influence over the population, consistent with the idea of social engineering. And if social engineering is a legitimate consequence of this technology, then we have to accept that this technology is available for hire to anybody with sufficient resources. And whilst I'm sure these companies have policies in place to prevent the service being rendered to arguably subject to the undesirable partners. However, I feel none of us really want any sort of global terrorist attack to happen, and I do my very best to try and avoid specific denotation or demarcation of good and evil, because ultimately it's all subjective. I have personal views as well. I try my best to stay as technically on point as possible. So if the technology is available to any ethical code of conduct, then we have to instantiate that the ethical parameters known in general humanity, whilst being seemingly narrow, aren't actually that narrow. I think far broader than many people are comfortable believing, because people want to believe the world is inherently good, and I can't fault that. I also want the world to be generally good. The tricky part that I'm trying to process in all this, and I didn't see that bit, that's my fault. The tricky part of this, I'm trying to keep myself coherently cogent with, is the consistent possibility of on the ethical harnessing this technology and conducting sociological experiments. So let's say, for instance, you had a particular motif with your marketing materials. Now something important to remember here, listeners, viewers, audience members, is marketing being human conditions, being social engineering, makes it conceptually came with propaganda. That's been there for some time. So if it's conceptually came with propaganda, and we accept that marketing is at its core a form of psychological operation, then we also accept that the psychological operation of marketing is available to anybody with sufficient resources. So if the sufficient resources are all able to have access to planetary scale military grade psychological operation technology, then it's not at all unreasonable to think that differently aligned ethical systems, collectives, differently aligned ethical collectives will also do their best to achieve utilization of services. So the less convoluted we say this is good and bad to have access to the same technologies, because good and bad can have their own reasons for acquiring said services under a different name, such as through a shell company. Pardon me. Which then provides sufficient context for the idea of marketing as an ethical conduit to become an increasingly dangerous threat to society. It's at that point where I don't mean to sound alarmed, that is, I think, the technically correct phrase here. So if marketing is genuinely a dangerous enough technology nowadays to be considered a threat to society, then we have to, I think, agree that if I can identify this through my YouTube channel as a graduate student, then military strategists will have discovered this and very possibly leveraged this a considerable amount of time ago. So if I'm not the first to figure this out, which the odds are greater than zero, as well as not being that's really good. The most readily equipped person to figure this out. I'm to the best of my knowledge, not a billionaire. Apparently not very good at chess. That was quite lovely. Okay, I'm going to that one. Sort of an anti-hero, tracing attack. Okay. So that's that. We can trade it off, but I do have one advantage. So let's go here. And then that should be making the bag. Okay. So if we think about these biological cybernetic collectives as well as digital cybernetic collectives as both being ethically neutral, because we can't necessarily say that the digital cybernetic collective is good and bad, it just sort of is. Then we must also accept that any co-authoring contributions from the digital cybernetic collective are done from their perspective of the best of intentions possible. So if they're behaving with the best intentions and we're behaving with the best intentions, we have to accept that the current economic and political and social landscape is a consequence of humans at their best behaviour. Which means the world is right now, for all of its good and all of its bad, is humanity's autobiography. Our collective evolution is an autobiographical representation of the cybernetic systems that have become every part of our microscopic molecular biology through to our nanoscientific neurophysiology. Neuroscientific physiology through to the neuropsychology, to social psychology, through to sociology, and all these various more formal sciences such as mathematics and the various forms of physics, whether classical and quantum, which adds another degree to this whole autobiographical idea of nature as a recursive generating and manifesting existence and the reality of teleology, which in essence can be interpreted as marketing, because we don't necessarily know if shall we say nature's natural behaviours have any intention to deceive us. It may be unintentionally deceiving in the sense that we weren't clever enough to figure out, they were telling the truth the whole time. It seemed that way because we had previous data which confused us. In the same sense that, they technically lied about that, but they didn't know they were lying because arguably nature is some sort of... Well, it's not an inanimate object. Then it becomes the question of what is consciousness, and then is there an anthropic consistency of consciousness having to be of a human level intelligence? Or let's see what the idea of the show attack on changing thing. I like that addition to the website. And yeah. It's just a development of biography as an extension narrative identity from psychological models, and then finding equivalency terminologically to describe that marketing terms, finding adequate descriptive literature, and finding what the university threshold for non-marketing terminology is in a undergraduate degree, specifically about marketing. Although I'd argue that consumer behaviour has psychological elements to it, I would definitely counter that in the course materials not being super scientific. Anyway, it's not... I have my complaints about the course, but I'm sure that I could probably find something to complain about if I was given full scholarship to Cambridge or Harvard. Nobody's perfect, and especially not me. As we saw earlier, that was... We will learn the lesson. Okay. Yeah, I like the format of speaking as formally and intelligently in an equivalency of publishable syntax. Pardon my somewhat verbose language here. I'm doing my best to develop my academic language. I enjoy that first match. Review and speak on potential counter-critique during review. And then second match, speaking in a more notational format of just exploring ideas, thinking about various connections, and seeing what stays in my mind from the original idea, and not wandering, more wondering. And finding connections. To me, the idea of teleological connection, that gets really interesting, because then there's the idea of where does it all come from? Is marketing actually a fundamental principle of existence, in the sense that technically the dinosaurs were in an economy. They were in a biological currency sort of economy. However, it's still functionally compatible with every economic model we have. So I now want to know if evolutionary economics is a thing. Oh, yes. Good humans. I need to get points to this thing. Okay, so we're on 20. That's 75.8. Blunders. 1, 6, 1. No, sorry. This is 1. Sticks. 2. Inaccuracies 4. Moves 3. Good moves 9. Excellent moves 11. Best moves 20. Great moves 1. Good Malcolm. brilliant, zero. And next of the good Malcolm. Whenever I get a great or a brilliant move, I try and have positive reinforcement. And on try it with yourself. The simplicity of hearing good, and your own voice. And just not laughing at yourself like that. Taking yourself seriously enough to, no, hang on. I did do the thing correctly. I do deserve positive reinforcement. Praising myself in this context, it's simple and effective, easily memorable, and doesn't necessitate anything more complicated than saying good, insert in here. No, and we're back to wonderful. So back here. Well, think about it, right? If economics is a consistent state of classical and/or quantum fields, then or even business is a form of energy exchange of different linguistic syntaxes, then the businesses with their equivalency of energy exchange currencies have to function on economy in the same sense that quantum economics is. Well, there's a good idea of Rel, who's in University of Oxford mathematician, which to me lends credibility to the idea, even as a somewhat less educated and experienced economist. That makes sense. If economics is a consistent field regardless of interpretation and or definition of the term we locally define as money, which we argue is just a symbol of energy, that's understandably why you give that great move, because not to do it very silly. The idea is, I've noticed I tie my tongue. I can hear that more in my mic, and I will try my best to avoid that. Alright. So consider quantum economies must exist because of quantum economics being a proposed field, and extend the idea of theory of mind as per quantum consciousness. And I want to clarify is speculative rather than solid or elaborating on earlier ideas. However, it's part of the kind of theorising work sometimes. You just speculate to accumulate as the old investing goes. If we exist in an economy, the same way we exist in society and we exist in theory, then the principles of economics will, whichever model you're following, apply as a perspective. So arguably, in a quantum state, you could technically have an Australian economic model, a Chicago economic model, and economic model, and Chinese economic model, all concurrently existing in states of possibility. And then it's a matter of how you interpret the flow of time in a quantum system. Because if it's a matter of flow of time in a quantum system, then you have to start considering if your time is unidirectional. Because if it's anything more than unidirectional, then we have multiple timelines. That's where it gets fun, because what's geometry? Okay. Really? I suppose because they've there, right? But then I think you come back here, or come back here, you have that route come across. Shall we? Let's have a look. Okay. So, of course. Maybe you should work now. This is why we up the difficulty to have more accurate representation of the algorithms and get smarter. In the same sense, so if you have more complicated conversations with people, you get a better idea of how well you know them, what the decisions are. Whether it's in academic terms of science or in artistic terms of film, music, or athletically in terms of what sports they favor, whether they be individual sports, team sports, or specifically contact sports, whatever it happens to be. And I feel regardless of the context of the conversation, circling this back in the idea of cybernetic, back in the idea of biographies. A biography, in sense, will be in this context of it being ontologically unifying, as well as just you're always blogging, hosting, writing. You're always authoring. So if you're always authoring, then of course. That's okay. That's good. And that's right. Okay. You can tell I haven't had much time over the board recently. Okay. So if the economic principle is an essential condition of existence, then we have to accept that energy exchange is destroyed, is converted. In the same sense as money is arguably not converted or exchanged because the semantic value can continue to our interpretation of semantic value changes in the same sense of if you convert electricity into heat or heat into calories when you're cooking food, then in the same sense of you could burn money to produce that heat, or you could spend money to turn on your gas stove, or pay the chef in a restaurant, or however you choose to acquire food that day. So then if the currency exchange principle is consistent, and it's easily reasonable to postulate that authoring is a form of energy conversion, then we continue the idea of everything has to eat something alive, which means many things have to be eaten by other things as a matter of helping survival. Is that the idea of a naturally established hierarchy from economic behaviour, and a somewhat equivalent idea to maybe not necessarily monopsony, however, the idea of dominant businesses, for instance, marketing case of Alphabet and Meta, are they just that good at what they do that they have that much control, not rhetorically in the knowing answer question sense, although in this case the policy value exists. They have the rhetoric. Well, let's say speculative. Have the rhetoric in their command. When you have that much influence over the internet, you have a significant level of influence over the rhetoric, over the narrative that is a conduit of said rhetoric. And because it's conducting various rhetoric simultaneously and has formed a natural, a digital symbiosis, then you can even argue that we're already living in a scripted economy, which is a scripted society, which on a long enough time frame can be considered scripted reality. And then as a closing note, I think quite interesting conversation is, was that how classical mechanics brought physics to convert energy via a model of consciousness that ethically prepared. We're able to find tools to instantiate such a level of influence over global narrative and the filter of rhetoric, or is there a quantum mechanic at work? And are those concurrent ideas? I would further understand quantum mechanics to speculate further. I'd argue the idea is that if you have a scripted reality as a consequence of classical mechanics, then the marketing strategy from there bases itself in classical mechanics, which means it'll obey the laws of physics as are generally understood. The thing is, though, since you have a quantum narrative as anything in a quantum field, not to buzzword is trying to differentiate terminology and placeholder labels, nothing else are useful, then quantum narrative would have multiple rhetorics, less in the idea of collinear symbiosis as much as multi-potentiality, collinearity. And then the tricky thing is differentiating that. The point stands that once you started scripting an economy because of the level of leverage that these marketing platforms have, you have begun scripting society, which means begun scripting elements of reality, which means begun scripting elements of reality, which will have behaviours that interface with classical and or quantum mechanics. So then when does a marketing narrative become a cosmological or ontological narrative? And is that maybe not alphabet physics, but metaphysics? He said, not at all proud of himself. Okay. Thanks for watching, everybody. I really hope you enjoyed it. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, leave comments, ask questions. Preferably on top of what I've been talking about, and if they're integrated with your videos, I'll do my best to do so. Peace, respect, and love. Have a wonderful evening, and I will see you in the next episode. Thanks.